It's been 11 months now since this war broke out. 11 months of just constant news about the fighting between Israel and Hamas.
Yeah. It feels like it's been impossible to escape, honestly. It's everywhere you turn the headlines, the social media feeds, even just casual conversations.
And I think for a lot of people, it's hard to wrap their heads around it all, Like, how did we even get here? What led to this point? And that's exactly what we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive.
It's a lot to unpack, to be sure. 11 months in, and we've got access to a mountain of information about this conflict. Detailed reports from organizations on the ground, firsthand accounts from people who've been caught in the crossfire, expert analyses trying to make sense of it all.
It's a lot to process, which is why we're here to help sift through it all, connect the dots, and hopefully give you a clearer understanding of what's at stake. We're talking about the global impact of this conflict, the human cost, and what this might all mean for the future. But before we dive into the current situation, we kind of need to rewind a bit, right?
Absolutely. To really grasp the gravity of what's happening today, you've got to understand the historical context. We're talking about a century of conflict here.
A century, that's a lot of history.
It is. And we don't have time to cover every single detail, but there are some key events that are absolutely crucial to understanding the roots of this war.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. What are the historical milestones that have shaped this conflict? What led us to where we are today?
Well, a good place to start is 1948, the formation of Israel. This event, as you can imagine, was a pivotal moment in history, and it led to the displacement of a huge number of Palestinians and the creation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip.
And these territories, they become central to the conflict moving forward, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Just a couple of decades later, in 1967, the Six-Day War breaks out, and Israel ends up occupying both the West Bank and Gaza.
And it's this occupation that really fuels a lot of the tension and violence we see even today.
Exactly. These two events, the 1948 war and the 1967 war, they essentially laid the groundwork for the conflicts that continue to this day.
And one of the most significant consequences of that occupation was the Palestinian uprisings, the intifadas. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Sure. The first Intifada began in the late 1980s and lasted for several years. It was a mass uprising, mostly nonviolent, against the Israeli occupation.
And it really captured the world's attention, didn't it? This was a turning point in how people viewed the conflict.
It really did. It forced Israel to recognize the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, as a negotiating partner, which eventually led to the Oslo Accords in the 90s.
Which, on the surface, seemed like a huge step towards peace, right?
It did. And while the Oslo Accords had their issues, they did represent a glimmer of hope, a potential path towards a two-state solution. But as we know, that peace was short-lived.
And the second intifada, which erupted in the early 2000s, that was even more violent and really shifted the dynamics of the conflict once again. But before we get to that, let's fast forward a bit to 2007. Hamas takes control of Gaza, and Israel responds with a blockade.
Right, and this blockade becomes a major point of contention. Israel argues that it's essential for security reasons to prevent Hamas from smuggling weapons into Gaza.
But it's also been incredibly controversial, with many arguing that it amounts to collective punishment of the Palestinian people living in Gaza.
Exactly. Critics of the blockade argue that it's had a devastating impact on the lives of ordinary Gazans, and the statistics seem to back that up, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. By 2023, a staggering 81% of Gazans were living below the poverty line. That's a direct result of the blockade, according to many experts.
And it's that desperation, that sense of hopelessness that really sets the stage for the war that erupts in 2023. And that brings us to, well, the day it all changed, October 7, 2023. I mean, imagine waking up thinking it's a normal day and then, bam, everything changes.
Yeah, October 7th, a date that, unfortunately, will be seared into the memories of so many people for years to come. But for those who might not remember all the details, can you set the scene for us? What happened on that day?
It was a surprise attack, a well-coordinated one at that, launched by Hamas.
It wasn't just like a couple of rockets fired across the border. This was a full-on assault, right?
Right. Hamas launched a multi-pronged offensive land, sea, air. They seemed to be hitting Israel from every angle.
I remember those images, those videos of Hamas fighters breaking through the Gaza barrier. I mean, it was just shocking to see.
It was a bold move, and it allowed them to get their fighters into Israel, into towns and kibbutzim, And then, of course, you had the rockets, thousands of them, raining down on Israeli cities.
And in the midst of all that chaos and destruction, there were certain events, specific attacks that really stood out for their brutality. The Korean Music Festival, for example.
Yeah,
Just a horrific, horrific event.
a massacre, really. Hamas gunmen opened fire on a crowd of young people who were just, you know, trying to enjoy a music festival.
And those images, they were broadcast around the world. It was impossible to ignore the human cost of this conflict.
And it wasn't just the music festival. There were attacks on homes, families, just ordinary people going about their lives, suddenly caught in the crossfire.
And in the face of that kind of aggression, Israel responded with force, launching Operation Swords of Iron.
It was a declaration of war, Israel's first since 1973.
Yeah.
And when a country formally declares war like that, the stakes are incredibly high.
It's a sobering thought. And it's easy to get caught up in the military strategies, the geopolitical maneuvering, all of that, but we can't lose sight of the human beings at the heart of this conflict. People like Rafat al-Hariri, the Palestinian poet.
Yeah, his death was a tragedy.
He used his words to advocate for peace, to try to bridge divides, and yet he, too, became a victim of this violence.
It really underscores just how indiscriminate this kind of conflict can be.
And unfortunately, al-Hariri's story is just one of many. The IDF's offensive in Gaza, as we've read in the reports, was devastating.
Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Hospitals, already struggling to cope with limited resources because of the blockade, were completely overwhelmed.
It's like the blockade had created this incredibly vulnerable situation in Gaza, and then the offensive just made everything exponentially worse.
Absolutely. And then, of course, you have the Al-Shifa hospital strike on November 3rd.
An event that I think sent shockwaves around the world.
Hundreds of civilians, many seeking medical attention, lost their lives in that strike.
It's hard to even fathom, the sheer scale of suffering caused by something like the Al-Shifa hospital strike. Did that event, did it change anything in terms of how the conflict was perceived globally?
Well, it certainly intensified calls for a ceasefire, for humanitarian aid to be allowed into Gaza. But the conflict tragically didn't end there.
It actually spread, didn't it? It wasn't just contained to Israel and Gaza anymore.
Exactly. Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, they saw the situation in Gaza as, well, part of a larger struggle against Israel.
And they got involved.
Right. They started launching rockets into Israel, carrying out these cross-border raids, and that gave Israel I guess you could say, the justification they needed to launch a full-scale invasion of Lebanon in October 2024.
So now you've got multiple fronts in this war, multiple countries drawn into the conflict.
And it gets even more complex when you factor in the attacks on U.S. bases in the Middle East.
Right. Those attacks, those were attributed to groups like Hezbollah, but also potentially to Iran and Syria.
Exactly. And that's where you really start to see the broader geopolitical dimensions of this conflict. This axis of resistance, as it's sometimes called, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah. They see this as a fight against Western influence in the region, with Israel, right at the center of it all.
So it's not just about land, it's not just about religion, it's about these larger power struggles playing out on a global stage.
Absolutely. And as the conflict escalates, it pulls in more players. It exacerbates existing tensions. You even had the Houthi movement in Yemen launching attacks on ships in the Red Sea, claiming they were in some way connected to Israel.
The Houthis in Yemen. It's like this conflict just kept metastasizing, spreading its tendrils in every direction.
And each new development, each new attack, just made the situation that much more volatile, that much more difficult to resolve.
And what about the diplomatic fallout from all of this?
It's been significant, to say the least. We saw 9 countries severing diplomatic ties with Israel. Think about that. 9 countries cutting off diplomatic relations. A pretty clear signal of the shifting global sentiment towards this conflict.
It does feel like there's been a real shift in how the world views Israel, a growing criticism of, the occupation, the settlements, the use of force in Gaza.
Right. And you can't underestimate the role that media coverage, particularly social media, has played in shaping those perceptions.
It's brought the realities of this conflict, the human cost, the complexities, to the forefront of the global conversation in a way that we haven't really seen before.
Definitely. But amidst all the devastation and despair, there was one development, one event that offered a glimmer of hope: the Beijing Declaration in July of 2024.
Right, the Beijing Declaration. That was where, surprisingly, several Palestinian factions, including Hamas and Fatah, agreed to form a unity government.
It was a truly historic moment, this idea of these rival factions putting aside their differences, at least temporarily, to work towards a common goal.
It did feel like a potential turning point, a chance for peace. But of course, there's always a but in these situations. Of course. It's still fragile, this unity. I mean, previous attempts at reconciliation have fallen apart. There are deep divisions within Palestinian society, but it's a start.
It is. So as we try to wrap our heads around this incredibly complex conflict, this war that's dragged on for 11 months and counting, what can we take away from all of this?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that this is far from over. This conflict, this war, its ramifications are going to continue to shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come.
It's a sobering thought, but an important one.
It is.
And for our listeners, we encourage you to keep learning, keep asking questions, keep engaging with this issue, because ultimately peace, or the hope for peace, that's something we have to strive for, even in the darkest of times.